that it's just a kind of a joy to study. Think about. Get there eventually. We're in verses 5 through 9 is what we're going to look at tonight. We looked at the first 4 verses earlier. I'm going to read it. For unto the angels hath he not put in subjection the world to come, whereof we speak. But one in a certain place testified, saying, What is man, that thou art mindful of him? Or the Son of Man, that thou visitest him? Thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Thou crownedst him with glory and honor, and didst set him over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. For in that he put all in subjection under him, he left nothing that is not put under him. But now we see not yet all things put under him, but we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor, that he with the grace of God should taste death for every man. This passage, the concept is that when God created us, he gave us dominion over the world. It was ours. He made it, he created it, he turned it over to us. And tells us there in Genesis, Genesis 1, he created it for us, and he intended us to have dominion over it. He gave it. Okay. The Bible makes more of this than I have paid attention to. And so it's a kind of a joy to look at, study, think about. In verse 26 of Genesis 1, God said, Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. He created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and over every living thing. God said, Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you. And every beast of the earth, to every bird of the sky, to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. So he gave us dominion when after he had created the earth. He gave it to us. But because of man's sin, men lost dominion over the earth. That's what he says. He's going to get to that point, and lo and behold, Satan has it. That's the point in the temptation of Jesus. He took him up to a high place and showed him all the kingdoms of men and said, I'll give you all of these if you'll fall down and worship me. Why in the world did he say? Well, he had them. He has dominion. He took it and was willing to give it back if Jesus would worship him. He didn't really care about the dominion. He cared about Jesus in this war with Jesus. And so he enslaved men by his possession of the earth. He turned many elements of this earth against us. Even now, the worm and the insect eats our bodies. The very thing we were given dominion over feeds on us, fights us. The Lord said to Adam there in Genesis 3, said the ground won't yield its fruit easily. And so the world that we had and had dominion over is opposed to us, hates us, is trying to destroy us. So, but that situation is only temporary. And according to God's purpose, man will again be given dominion over the earth. And he quotes this quotation that's in here, one in a certain place. It is from the 8th Psalm. And let's turn over there because the quotation here is not a full reading of the 8th Psalm, which we'll refer to. He quotes this. How excellent is thy name in all the earth, who has set thy glory above the heavens. Out of the mouth of babes and sucklings hast thou ordained strength because of thine enemies, that thou mightest still the enemy and the avenger. When I consider thy heavens and the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. God created all that. He created the universe, the moon and the stars and everything on this earth. And he says, what is man that thou art mindful of? He gave us dominion over everything he created. And the Son of Man that thou visitest. For thou hast made him, us, a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honor. We were given dominion over the earth, just a little lower than the angels. Thou madest him to have dominion over the works of thy hands. Thou hast put all things under his feet, all sheep and oxen, yea, and the beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, the fish of the sea, and whatsoever passeth through the paths of the sea. O Lord, our Lord, how excellent is thy name in all the earth. We were granted dominion. And from this quotation, it's obvious that God intends that we will possess this. But that hasn't been accomplished yet. We know we lost it. We know we lost it when Adam sinned. Of course, we've sinned. It says in verse 8, now we see not yet all things put under him. We don't have to be. He goes on to describe throughout Hebrews some of the things we don't have dominion over. One is death. But we do see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels, in other words, like us. We were made a little lower than the angels. He wants to. So that he, by the grace of God, the goodness of God, might taste death for every man, crowned with glory and honor for the suffering of death. So that there is in Jesus, and he's going to expand that throughout this second chapter, the hint, the notion, the teaching that the dominion is going to be reaffirmed. And we have, later on in a different figure in chapter 6 and verse 19 and 20, he says, which hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which entereth into that within the veil, whither the forerunner is for us entered. Now he says the veil's still there, but the forerunner has entered. And so that's the same idea here. We don't have dominion, but we see Jesus. We have the promise, the real promise of receiving that dominion again. That we will enjoy the earth as our home and rule over it, even as Adam ruled over Eden. Yes. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate it. I forgot the man who discovered that. Excuse me, go ahead. Do you always whisper, or am I going deaf? What? Fontaine Murray. Yeah, well, I don't know which way, but yes, you're closer to the name either way than I was. But he did make the discovery of the currents in the ocean, several of them. The one that we're most familiar with is the Gulf Stream, but there are several other such currents. So that's a good point. Now, in the early part of this chapter, I keep switching to Psalm 8. I obviously need more markers. In the early part of this chapter, he said, we ought to give the more earnest heed to the things which we've heard, lest we should let them slip. And the verse 5 begins, unto the angels hath he not put in subjection. And may I suggest to you that the connector there, of course, you know that in the first chapter he's talked about the angels. Christ was greater than the angels. He was the Son. Well, here, when he refers to the angels, he's referring to the law of Moses. And that period of time when which the angels revealed the truth, the angels gave the law. For instance, Stephen says that they, in condemning the Jews, he says, you received the law by the disposition of angels and have not kept it. But here Paul says he's going beyond that. He says he didn't subject the world to come unto the angels. He says that's the business of Christ, to restore. The angels were not going to restore dominion, but Christ was. And so that's the connector, I think, between these two sections. David, of course, in verse 5, celebrating the manifestation of God's perfections. In the second part of the verse 5, he speaks of the goodness of God. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained. Thus he's talking about it's amazing. God gave us all this. You know, you look up in the stars at night and the moon, and you see the sun, and we see all those fabulous things that the telescopes have shown us about the constellations. And they were all given to us. They're ours. You can worry about ET and other planets, which nobody's. Let me just remind you, we haven't heard from anybody out there. In spite of all the science fiction you've heard and all NASA's listening for extraterrestrial life, some folks, those folks aren't talking. It's all made for us. That's what he's saying in Psalms 8. That what is man? Well, it's amazing that God gave man this tremendous creation that he made. It was made for you and me. And we trashed it. And the devil has it, but Christ is going to give it back to us. In verse 6, situation temporary. The Lord's intention is clear, but it hasn't been accomplished. I'm going to put this up here so I don't have to worry about it. We see Jesus as the pledge. In verse 6, where he says, one in a certain place testified, what is man that thou art mindful of him? God's special care. For instance, in Matthew 10 and verse 10, do you remember the passage where Jesus says, even the very hairs of your head are numbered? Can you imagine that? He has given all. He cares about us. It's astounding. He gave us all this. He numbers our hairs. He cares for us. What is man? It's unbelievable almost. In verse 7, thou madest him a little lower than the angels. Thou crownest him with glory and honor. You've been an object of wonder and sympathy throughout the universe. The angels apparently sometimes lean on their harps and listen to us, pay attention to us. We sing the songs of the redeemed. But there's no indication, by the way, let me stress this. There's no indication that the role in verse 7, thou madest him a little lower than the angels, there's no indication that's going to change. That somehow or other we're going to be ranked higher than the angels or the same as the angels. We're always going to be there. We're not angels. We're not going to be angels. We're men. God has blessed us incredibly. He says here that you crowned him with glory and honor. And those are two very similar words, synonymous almost in both languages, Hebrew and Greek. And the two of them are used together primarily for emphasis. And they express the idea of royal dignity, that a fullness of sort of a regal power which God has bestowed on Adam. man on the race, men. He gave us glory and honor. And so it is an immutable thing that God intends to restore us to that position. It's remarkable that he says in Revelation, the first chapter, that he's made us kings and priests to God. So perhaps we are restored or beginning to be restored. Here, yes. And still has. Certainly not the angels. He's going to talk about that later in this chapter 2 also. In that the angels are not forgiven. The angels that sinned are reserved. There's no forgiveness. He offers us forgiveness, which was a profound thing. In verse 7, he concludes by saying, he did set him over the works of thy hands. And then more emphatically in verse 8, thou hast put all things in subjection under his feet. So that second phrase is even more emphatic than the first. That we've been placed in a sovereign position over this earth and on this earth. So that's what Genesis 1 is saying. But in verse 9, we see Jesus, who was made a little lower than the angels for the suffering of death, crowned with glory and honor. Now, let me stress, you realize this is the same thing he says about us. We were made a little lower than the angels. Jesus was made a little lower than the angels. When God created us in verse 7, quoting Psalms 8, they were crowned. We were crowned with glory and honor. Jesus was made a little lower than the angels and crowned with glory and honor also. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the suffering of death, for the suffering of death, because we'll discuss that in the latter part of the chapter. But Jesus became like us. He became a man. Philippians 2, which I've studied with you many times, stresses the same idea. He became a man in order to die for us, to restore us to this position of dominion. It says in 1 Peter 3 and verse 22 that he's gone into heaven and is on the right hand of God. Angels and authorities and powers being made subject to him. Philippians 2 stresses his position. So, to summarize this section, I want you to turn with me over to Romans. I found this very interesting because I'd never noticed it. So stupid. When you discover something you've read 100 times, You just feel, what was I doing? What was I thinking? Look in verse 13. Excuse me, Romans 4. Here, for the promise that he should be heir of the world was not to Abraham or his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. Now, what I had never noticed was that phrase, heir of the world. That's the dominion. That's what Psalms 8 is talking about. It's what Hebrews 2 is talking about. Abraham was promised that through him, all nations would be blessed. We would receive again the dominion that we had in the Garden of Eden. That's what that heir of the world is. And he says the law, which is what's being stressed here in Romans 4, the law did not answer to that. And so here in Hebrews 2, it says, not to the angels did he put in subjection the world to come. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there's no transgression. We couldn't be forgiven under the law. We couldn't be restored to dominion. We were constantly under the curse of the law because we couldn't ever be forgiven. Therefore, it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of all. So all of those types and shadows of the law were just temporal arrangements. They were just occasional. They were just for a period, looking toward the redemption that was coming in Christ, the restoration of man's position which he had enjoyed initially. So, Revelation talks about the New Jerusalem. In 2 Peter, it talks about new heavens and a new earth. You ever thought about what they're talking about? We sometimes ask how beautiful heaven must be. Well, think about how beautiful Eden was, and we lost it. The Lord's intended now for 6,000 years to restore us to the position that we enjoyed in Eden. Forgiven, cleansed, pure. And in a world and an earth prepared for us and beautiful. We could call it heaven. He calls it new heavens and a new earth in one place. He says in another place that it was purified by fire in 2 Peter. So, anyway. But it's just such a beautiful passage, and I just never had realized the fact that Romans 4 and Psalms 2 were in the same vein. In Psalms 37, verse 9 beginning. He says, evildoers shall be cut off, but those that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. Forget a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Yea, they shall diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. Thou shalt diligently consider his place, and it shall not be. But the meek shall inherit the earth, and shall delight themselves in the abundance of peace. You know, he says the same thing in the Beatitudes. The meek shall inherit the earth. So as best I can tell, he's talking about our restoration, the restoration of our relationship with God that we had enjoyed. This second chapter is just fabulous. Let's go ahead and read it. For it became him, for whom are all things, and by whom are all things, and bringing many sons unto glory, to make the captain of their salvation perfect through sufferings. He became one of us. That's the point. For both he that sanctifieth and they who are sanctified are all of one. He became one of us. He became a man to deliver us. We're all of one. For which cause he's not ashamed to call them brethren. We're brethren. Now, chapter 1 has indicated that he was God. That he was, as he says here in the verse 3, he was the brightness of his glory, the express image of his person. But chapter 2 is emphatically saying he was a man. And that as a man, he came to restore us to where we were. And then he quotes a couple of passages. We'll look at them more next week, saying, I will declare thy name unto my brethren. In the midst of the church will I sing praise unto thee. Now that's, I hear brethren quote that every now and then as instrumental music. I'll sing in the congregation, and I'm not sure that's referring to the church. And again, I'll put my trust in him. The whole concept of the Son of God trusting in the Father. Do you understand that? God does not trust in God. Why? Faith comes by hearing. Hearing by the Word of God. We walk by faith, not by sight. So this passage, the reason it's being quoted, I will put my trust in him, is saying that Christ would be someone who had faith in God. I will put my trust in him. You do not have faith in someone that you know. God knows God. So the point of this passage is proving his humanity. He was like us because we are being asked to put our trust in God. But I don't know. Can you certainly say for a fact that God exists? No, you can't. You have to say, I believe that God exists. This also, I'll put my trust in as a quotation. And again, behold, I and the children which God has given me. Now, that's not talking about the fact that Jesus fathered children, but he's talking about his humanity. For as much then as the children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death God does not experience death. Men do. It's what defines us. It's part of the curse that we were under. He likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of death. Remember, he has the dominion now. The devil does. And the dominion had to be rescued back from him. And deliver them who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. We were in bondage to Satan because he has dominion over this world. For verily he took not on him the nature of angels, written in King James. He didn't become an angel, but he took on him the seed of Abraham. The angels were not subject to forgiveness. As I mentioned earlier, Jesus did not become an angel. He became like us, subject to death. Wherefore, in all things, it behooved him to be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful high priest in things pertaining to God, to make reconciliation for the sins of the people. For in that he himself hath suffered being tempted, he is able to succor them that are tempted. He could empathize with us because he was one of us. Now, you get some argument saying, well, then, did Jesus couldn't empathize, or the Christ, before he came to the earth, he couldn't empathize with us? I don't know. I'll let somebody else argue about that. We certainly would have difficulty understanding. You know, how many times have you talked to somebody and told them, you don't know what I'm going through? Well, 1 Corinthians 10 says, I do know what you're going through. He says there's nothing happened to you but such as is ordinary to man. But if we're talking about God, God may well empathize with us in the same sense that we do, but the Lord proved it to us so that we can absolutely believe that he empathizes because he's experienced what we have. So that if the empathy was always there, that's fine. But we believe it certainly now because Jesus became like one of us. And so he, as it says here, that he might be made like unto his brethren, that he might be a merciful and faithful. It's not saying that Jesus wouldn't have been merciful and faithful before, but it's saying that we can now believe that he's merciful and faithful because he's gone through what we go through and experienced the fear of death and the temptations of this life along with us. I talked too much. We'll look more at this second chapter, which is a fabulous chapter. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir. Actually, it's not. It's a quote from David in Psalms 8, and it's not a messianic passage. Yeah, he's talking about man himself. And his surprise is that God cares about us and cared enough to give us control of all the things he created. Yes, I've got about 15 or 20, and I found one that does that. I think the English Standard does that. But it is a question. It is an interpretive question. In other words, does the little refer to rank, which the King James and American Standard and all of those say it refers to rank, or does it refer to time, which some of the other translations do? And it's a purely it's not a textual answer. Yeah, it's a yeah. That's right. Some of them try to make those early verses 6 and 7 refer to Jesus. And if you're going to Rome, since it's a quotation from Psalms 8, there's just no way it can refer to Jesus. Yeah, good point. Good point.